Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Brandon, and together with John Sandama here at Mishkondareya, we have developed a program of events for Black History Month entitled Colonial Amnesia, a legal and historical review of the afterlife of Britain's rule in Africa. So the aim of the program that we've put together for Black History Month is to take a critical look at the history and legacy of over 2 centuries of Britain's rule in Africa. So John and I are very proud to welcome a range of impressive speakers and experts to help us embark on a process of recovering lost memories of a frequently overlooked and misunderstood period. In doing so, we hope to tap into a vibrant and dynamic intellectual space where history, law, race, and culture have combined to produce fresh ideas to challenge the toxic legacy of colonial injustice. For the opening session of the program, I'm delighted to introduce Senior Counsel Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is going to speak to the title, This Land is Ours, Recovery and Redistribution of Communal Land in Post-colonial South Africa. Now, Tembeka is going to speak this afternoon about the expropriation of land under British colonial rule in Southern Africa within the broader context of colonial injustice, and discuss his experiences of seeking redress through the courts and tribunals in that jurisdiction to return expropriated land to those who live and work on it. So Tembeka, I think you can hear me. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon, and over to you.
Thank you. I hope you will enjoy this afternoon, and I am pleased that I have been invited to speak on the topic that the land is ours. We remember apartheid. We remember its human tragedy. We remember its perversity, its neurosis, and its illogic. Many in your country, in England, fought against apartheid. Some in your country fought in support of apartheid. Others were indifferent to apartheid. But everyone and everywhere remembers apartheid. The international community gave us the language of protest. It gave us the language to denounce the inhumanity of apartheid. In 1973, the United Nations declared that apartheid was a crime against humanity. But in the remembrance of apartheid, we have, however, forgotten colonial conquest by the British. We have forgotten about the 2 centuries before the formal beginning of apartheid, that in fact the British had long laid the seeds of racial segregation, of property dispossession, and the construction of a racial oligarchy. The shaping of South African society, indeed, by the British, we can categorize it into 4 main areas: labor, land, cattle, and the imposition of an external culture and the destruction of local cultures. First, let's start with slavery. It is a shameful and a forgotten part of our history. But when the Dutch first settled in the Cape in 1652, one of their immediate requirements was labor. But Dutch laws prohibited the enslavement of the local native population. Within a few years, however, a solution was found. Slaves could be imported from the then Batavia, and that is now Sri Lanka, from West Africa, and from Madagascar. These slaves would later constitute an amalgam of a new society in the Cape, a new language, today we call that Afrikaans, and a new race, those today we call the colored people. The British took control of the Cape in 1806, and one of the first items of business was the abolition of slavery, which they did almost immediately after they took over. But a little known fact is that not all slavery was banned. Only the importation of external slaves was banned. Domestic slavery remained. It also increased in scale and intensity. When the labor needs of the British economy changed in the 1830s, as mobile labor was needed in line with the Industrial Revolution, slavery was no longer useful to the British economy. And as a result, in 1834, it was abolished. In the Cape, however, things were a little different. Slavery had extended to cover the whole of the Western and Eastern Cape. 1834 would not mark the end of slavery in practice, but only the change in the law. Whites in the Cape insisted on retaining their workers. The British government agreed. Slavery would change into new contracts of apprenticeship. Only the form had changed. The substance, however, did not. Another demand by the white owners of slaves was compensation. More than 1 million British pounds were voted to be paid by the British Parliament in 1834. This payment was compensation for the white South African slave owners, some of whom were British. And yet, slave owners retained the unfree labor of their slaves, now as apprentices and no longer called slaves. This would remain the case until a new law, the Master and Servants Law, was passed. That law remained in our law books at least until 1974, and it retained the basic elements of unfree labor. Many years later, this would also be altered and replaced by today's modern labor law. So the shameful past of our labor law regime ultimately lie in slavery. But slavery was not a mere blight in the system. It was part of a larger story which included land taking. History books that we grew up reading introduced the fiction of land trading between European settlers and the native populations in the Cape. And yet, the reality has been that land was taken through the barrel of a gun. Take the 1853 war between the British and the Xhosa of the Eastern Cape. In that war, the Xhosas were completely crushed. The war is known as the War of Mlanjeni, Men of the River. And that was a disastrous war for the Xhosa-speaking people. Thousands were killed. Ultimately, the Xhosa were pushed across the Kaya River and removed from their land. Importantly, the Xhosa lost the Amatola, the area around the Jumi, Kaiskama, and Buffalo rivers, their most prized pieces of land. They were pushed across the Kaya River and squeezed into confined space, a loss probably roughly equal the size of the loss of the whole country of Austria. A peace settlement had to be found, and with the end of the war, the law had begun to take its course. The British would retain the lands conquered during the war. The war had been expensive to Britain. It cost them some £3 million. For the Xhosa, however, the cost of the war went beyond money. There was a human tragedy. More than 20,000 Xhosas had died. Many were displaced. Many had left their places of birth. But the traditional forms of government were also destroyed. Sir George Grey landed in the Cape on the 4th of December, 1854. Before then, he had been governor of New Zealand. His mandate in New Zealand was to civilize the barbarian and hedonist races of those lands. Having suppressed the indigenous people of New Zealand through military conquest and ethnic killing, Grey was sent to the Cape to build hospitals, schools, courts, instruments to impose the will of empire. As governor, he would establish a government and thereby accomplish the civilizing mission. Grey, however, was a lucky man. Between 1856 and 1857, the Xhosa killed their own cattle, thousands of them, arising from the prophecies of a young woman, Nongqawuse, who, like Mlanjeni, had visions of the disappearance of whites and the return of the life of the Xhosa to the age before the arrival of the British. Nongqawuse's prophecies did not materialize. White employers and their agents plundered the villages for labor. They collected hundreds of starving, emaciated Xhosa people, sold them to farmers and other employers for anything between £1 and £5 per head. Grey was finally able to control the land of the Xhosa. Not only were the Xhosa turned into wage laborers, their land was also placed under the control of the British government. So far, I have spoken about land and labor. Yet, cattle in Xhosa society were the main symbol of wealth. In the last frontier war of 1878, the Xhosas had lost 45,000 heads of cattle. Each frontier war, and there were 9 of them, was marked by cattle ransom, the surrender of cattle as a suit for peace. Without cattle, the Xhosa would be wholly dependent on the wage economy. So the strategy was not a mere conquest over land. nor was it a mere desire for political control. It was a strategy of total destruction of any semblance of political and economic existence. In the War of Mlanjeni in 1850 to 1855, some 60,000 cattle had been confiscated by the British. But it was the Nongausa incident of 1858 which marked the greatest single cattle loss of the Xhosa. Some 400,000 cattle had died, either by killing or starvation. And at the height of the cattle killing frenzy, some 40,000 people had died of hunger, starvation, and diseases. As the suffering deepened, Sir George Grey, now governor, seized upon the opportunity for the further land grabs. There would be political, economic, and social advantages arising out of the famine. Those who could work were now fully subject to the new labor contract, which in all resembled slavery. Divisions among Africans had also heightened. In the coming years, more would be sent up for labor for a pittance. Starvation continued the carnage. In this climate of no cattle, no food, no land, no authority, the subjugation was complete. At the end of that war, law could now begin. One of the primary pieces of legislation had been piloted by Cecil John Rhodes, known as the Glen Grey Act of 1896. It was only applicable in the Cape. The impact of the Glen Grey Act was to restrict the amount of land that could be allocated to Africans. It also gave government sweeping powers to reduce African stock. The consequences of keeping stock in excess of government allocation was severe. Cattle could be impounded, sold, and the owners could be punished, sometimes including whipping. The structure of the Glen Grey Act would later be replicated in what we refer to as the Native Land Act of 1913. The Native Land Act prohibited the ownership of land by African people without the permission of the government. With politics, war, and economic interests having decided the fate of native races, new laws could now be laid out. One of them, as I pointed out, was the 1913 Land Act. It carved up the country into native reserves and areas for European settlement. The policy of apartheid was inaptly named separate development, but it really perpetrated racial segregation and the balkanization of the country into separate homelands, a process which was completed in 1963 with the grant of self-government to the Transkei, the very first Bantustan. In the 1980s, apartheid experienced internal ruptures and could not withstand its own external and internal pressures. It collapsed. A promise for the return of the land emerged. Now, with the new conditions no longer the same as those that underpinned the struggle for freedom, there was a new struggle. It would be underpinned by the principle of constitutional supremacy. The African National Congress, the prime liberation organization, had over time bought into the idea of constitutionalism. In 1979, Zimbabwe negotiated its independence at Lancaster. One of the contentious clauses in those negotiations was the property clause. Should the land taken from the native people during colonialism be returned, and if so, on what conditions? Lancaster produced a constitution. From the onset, the constitutional property clause would allow the retention of land acquired under colonialism. But the democratic state would have the power to force the compulsory return of the land for public benefit, which includes the resettlement of persons without land. By the year 2000, after 20 years of trial and error, the model of Zimbabwe had failed, with the failure of the central government to use the tools at its disposal. The paradox, however, is that when Mugabe's ZANU-PF produced a draft property clause in 2000, it simply replicated the Lancaster Agreement, meaning that land reform would largely follow the market fundamental trajectory. It was, in fact, the alliance under the Movement for Democratic Change which advocated for an alternative property clause. We know from history that ZANU-PF lost the constitutional referendum. Its new proposals advocated for a seizure of agricultural land with no compensation. But the great lesson from that loss was the recognition of the failure of the market-driven fundamentalist approach to land reform. The casualty was, of course, the rule of law. Judges, black or white, who insisted on a fair process were instructed to resign, others fled the country, and those who remained were openly and intimidated. The rule by the army had thus displaced the rule of law. Today's announcements in Zimbabwe concern the return of the status quo ante bellum, which promises the return of the land to white settlers. But everyone knows it is impossible to put the genie back into the bottle. Hence, the inevitable slide into military authoritarianism to enforce the return of the land to white owners. I suggest that Zimbabwe's land reform collapsed under the weight of market fundamentalism, disrespect of the rule of law, corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and perhaps structural flaws. But we should now show solidarity with the people of Zimbabwe to forge their own way forward. Zimbabwe's model to constitutional property was soon followed in Namibia, some 10 years after Lancaster. The 4 constitutional elements relating to property, which first appeared in Zimbabwe, now found their way into the Namibian constitution. Within 4 years after Namibia's independence, in 1994, South Africa also entered the family of free African states. Property, like in Zimbabwe and Namibia, was a major sticking point in the negotiations towards democracy. A formula borrowed from Zimbabwe, perfected in Namibia, would also be applied in South Africa. Property acquired under colonialism and apartheid would not be uprooted at once. Instead, the agreement was that the state would have the power to expropriate for resettlement or land reform, subject to the payment of just and equitable compensation. But we know from experience that more than 25 years after the attainment of freedom in South Africa, that dream of land restitution is yet to be realized. In fact, it remains further and further away. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that neither Zimbabwe nor Namibia got the constitutional scheme for land reform right. Ancestral lands are yet to return. Quibbles about the definition of who is entitled to what dominate our discourses. Commercial agricultural land remains in the hands of the few. Many are unable to enter the property market through lack of access to finance. In some, millions starve while a fortunate few relish the wealth from the country. So how do we do this? The land surface that was taken remains the same. The land that was taken in 1913 in South Africa was 123 million hectares. At that stage, there were only 9 million people living in this country. Today, the same number of hectares remains, but there are 58 million people that are in the country. The cultural, language, and even race complexions of the people from whom the land was taken has evolved over time. The nature of the land itself has evolved. Unlike 300 years ago, land as an asset now competes with stocks, with bonds, and other classes of assets as symbols of wealth. Perhaps in the same way that cattle, rather than land, were once the most visible sign of wealth among Africans. So, what are these avenues that we might wish to consider? The first is the examination of how the land will be acquired. I have referred to the difficulties of constitutional property protections and their respective design. Our constitution is potentially an expansive one. It enables the state to acquire property for itself and to acquire property for redistribution if it can show that such acquisition is in the public interest. When that power of property acquisition is used, our constitution gives no guarantee that the owner would receive a market-based price for the price of land. It simply talks of just compensation. And therefore, the shift from value to compensation is significant as reflective of the possibility of non-financial forms of compensation. And so we should re-examine our attachments to cash-based compensation formulas. Secondly, if expropriation must be considered to be a key mechanism for the acquisition of land, the question of what is just and equitable compensation will necessarily come up for debate. Just compensation, which has not been defined in the Constitution, is itself based on the idea of justice. Expropriation in the public interest is not intended to cause injustice, but to reverse the injustice of history. Despite the existence of a permissive constitution, we have stagnated as a country in the area of land reform. Instead of providing concrete and tangible meanings to the constitution, consistent with its anti-colonial foundations, we have instead praised it. Many refer to our constitution as the best constitution. They refer to it as the most progressive constitution, as a liberal constitution, as a radical constitution. But what we forget is that a constitution is primarily a guide for collective action. Yes, it is also a symbol of our collective soul and vision, but it is primarily a guide for collective action. It is not self-executing. And so by hallowing it, we risk hollowing it of its meaning. My argument is that it is time to take the Constitution off the shelf, dust it off, and put it on the land to work. The fourth is taking ancestral land or customary land seriously. The meaning of this term need not always be contentious. In many instances, we can work out with relative ease what areas were occupied by what groups at the time of colonial conquest. But this topic is sometimes employed to open up ethnic cleavages, a clever tactic that the apartheid and colonial state once used. And this is a problem not only in South Africa, it is a problem in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, and elsewhere. We should resist the ethnicization of the land reform program. It is sheer happenstance that the largest concentration of Xhosa-speaking people are in the Eastern Cape. It is by no means natural. So land is important, but the country is more important. Land should therefore not be distributed on ethnicity, but on need. Fifth, working out who was where, when, need not necessarily have the same function as resettlement in those areas. So the legitimacy of the claim to a particular piece of ground should not be conflated with entitlement to that land. Tribal, ethnic, or ancestral claims must necessarily yield to the national interest. Samora Machel reminded us eloquently, for the nation to live, the tribe must die. And so the issue of ancestral claims to the land remains of significance. The focal point, as always, is the reversal of the obliteration of history, of memory, of existence of the people. The restoration of these precepts of existence is sometimes emotional. It is often spiritual. It is often about a sense of belonging. So changing names, for instance, to reflect the richness of the cultural inheritance of South Africa could be a major step forward. In this country, we do not deserve to have a town named after George Gray, like Greytown, nor do we deserve to have a town named after, called East London. We don't deserve a town known as John Graham, nor do we deserve a town known as Harry Smith. And so will the symbolism of passing a law that entitles everyone access to their sites of spiritual significance, such as graves, without any payment of compensation to the present owners of land where those sites are located. So if land cannot contribute to nation building, then it has not served its purpose. If the return of the land simply results in the splitting of the nation, then how different are we from those who came to this continent by boat to pillage and to plunder it? Sixth, the debate about expropriation without compensation should be taken with the appropriate level of proportionality and careful balancing. In Europe, it has long been the law that expropriation without compensation is not unlawful per se, as long as it does not impose excessive burden on individuals. Therefore, a deprivation of property without compensation could be justifiable in certain circumstances. And so rather than thinking too much about those circumstances, our focus should be on striking the appropriate equilibrium between the interests of the nation in land reform, the interests of the landless, and those from whom the land must be taken. Mandela's own idea of land reform drew connections between land reform and nation building. In 1988, he noted, "The experience of all countries everywhere is that if such wrongs are not put right, then the bitterness lives on for many generations. Our land reform program helps redress the injustices of apartheid. It fosters national reconciliation and stability. It underpins economic growth and improves household welfare and food security." 7, it is now plain for everybody to see that the land reform program in Zimbabwe enriched the political elite at the expense of the nation. Those with access to the machinery of state were the clear winners that took all, until there was an internal rupture about the sharing of the spoils of the land looting. The South African land reform program is equally challenged by crony capitalism, which will further marginalize true subaltern interests. We cannot accept a narrow nationalistic discourse underpinned by ethnic chauvinism. We need a truly progressive land reform which privileges the interests of the marginalized. To achieve this, we should not be happy with the rhetoric that uses the notion of our people only to enrich the political elite. We should be demanding greater transparency and accountability. We should be asking who has benefited from farm allocation, what criteria were used, how much was paid, where did the money go? Inasmuch as land reform must address the national question, it should recognize that class remains one of the major threats to democracy. The fundamental question thus remains, what is the class agenda of land reform? 8, and finally, addressing the class question challenges us to face the issue of the ethics that drive land reform. Frantz Fanon writes in The Wretched of the Earth under the chapter Pitfalls of National Consciousness about the paradox of freedom. The Algerians had defeated the French, but had they not adopted the morally corrupt ways of the French? In South Africa, we should make the argument explicit. Now that we have defeated the whites, have we not adopted their morally corrupt ways? It is often asked, when will this end? Can we not put a deadline? But I think it is wrong to think of land reform as a destination with an end. Rather, land reform is a way of being in the world, a way of imagining a new future. The disparities in wealth are strong indicators of the failure of the constitutional project. The cynical uses of the Constitution in defense of the privileges of apartheid and colonialism is another. Imagining ways of confronting these and overcoming them is a constant challenge of committed constitutionalists. It is the rule of law that we should put at the center of this new imagination. In forging ahead with the struggle for a just society, we always look back to understand the present. To understand apartheid, we look back at colonialism. To understand current South African dynamics, we look back at both colonialism and apartheid. We remember the words of the novelist William Faulkner in the novel Requiem for a Nun, written in 1951, who writes, "The past is not dead. In fact, it is not even past." And so today, the cries of Sharpeville, the cries of Langa, the cries of Soweto reverberate with us once again. We remember where and why it all started, with the land. Thank you.
Tembeka, thank you so much for really an extraordinary opening address. Really, you've demonstrated a combination of knowledge, of vision, of insight, and of imagination. And we really are indebted to you. Thank you very much, Tembeka.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.